Welcome to Throwback Thursday here at the Critical Cinema Club, where we discuss films from years gone by. This week, I'll be discussing another one of my favourites, which is The Crow, and I want to see if this film still holds up. This discussion will be spoiler heavy from the outset, so please be warned. Released in 1994, The Crow stars the late Brandon Lee as Eric Draven. Brandon tragically lost his life while making this film towards the end of production. I'm not looking to get into the circumstances of that accident during the course of this video, except for where I'll point out what effect this had on the finished product. Eric Draven and his fiancée, Shelley, are murdered by a gang on the eve of their wedding in horrific fashion. 1 year later, and Eric is resurrected by a mysterious crow in order for him to exact revenge and deliver justice. The film explores themes of love, loss, revenge, justice, and redemption. It also explores the corruption of power and a cycle of violence. The exact nature of the crow itself and how this works, or indeed why, are never explained, and I think the film is all the better for it. There is deleted footage out there of the Skull Cowboy, a character from the graphic novel from which the film is based on. In those scenes, the Skull Cowboy delivers a lot of exposition on how this resurrection has come to be, what the rules are, etc., but I can see why this was cut from the film. It just isn't needed. This film does a great job of stripping the story down to just what is required, and I think it's a good example of a tight script and good pacing. As part of the film's opening sequence, we are presented with a shot of what is supposed to be the Detroit skyline as we fly around the buildings. The miniature work is pretty obvious on my large 4K TV, but I still think it's pretty impressive nonetheless. Certainly better than some CGI offerings I've seen in the past. Years ago, on an older TV, it really wasn't that noticeable at all. One of the things I like a lot about this film is just how tight it is, which I mentioned a little earlier. Within 5 minutes, the crow's pecking at Eric's headstone, and within 10, he's wandering the streets of Detroit trying to make sense of what has happened to him. In a lot of films, you might get a 20 or 30 minute lead up to the double murder, but the crow wastes no time in getting to the point, and I think other filmmakers could take note. Now, a good example of this is how we are introduced to T-Bird's gang. We're shown who they are, what they've done, and indeed what sort of characters they are. There's a brief scene of them blowing up an arcade and being just all-round bad guys doing bad things, and then we are shown their reactions to seeing a police car, cementing their place as no good villains. I like that it's tied in with two of the main characters in Sarah and Officer Albert. It keeps the story trim and connected. When Eric enters his apartment, this scene and the next one here do a lot of lifting and manage to seamlessly accomplish several things at once while also being fantastic sequences. In the first scene, we see Eric coming to terms with what's happened to him and Shelley. At the same time, we are shown how they are killed, and it builds on the previous scene of developing the gang further. At the end of all of this, we are also shown Eric's healing powers. This short scene does several things at once. It shows us how much Eric and Shelley loved each other. It shows us Eric's intense grief. We are shown how they died, as well as how awful these gang members are. And lastly, we are shown a glimpse of what Eric has become. Outside of a few phrases spoken by the gang, it accomplishes all of this without words. This is an amazing example of show, don't tell, and is a fantastic piece of filmmaking. Within 10 minutes, we know who most of the major players are, their motivations, and the stage is set for some revenge and retribution without feeling rushed or forced. We also see footage that is clearly lifted from the alleyway scene, as the apartment entry was clearly not shot before Brandon's death, but it all works perfectly fine. There's a short scene that follows showing the gang together, displaying their twisted camaraderie, which is needed so that we can feel their grief and fear later on as they are picked off one by one. Back at the apartment, we're given a really powerful scene. We're shown how much Eric and Shelley loved each other, and just how intense Eric's grief actually is as he begins his transformation into the Crow. We've seen a lot of superhero transformations over the years, but did any hit as hard as this one does after that? With Burn by The Cure playing in the background as Eric dons that iconic look, if you don't get goosebumps when he stands there in the window looking out at the city as lightning strikes, then this film is just not for you. One detail I enjoyed about this scene is that despite his pain and grief, Eric still has the capacity for kindness as he shares a moment to comfort Gabriel, his cat. This foreshadows his humanity still being intact despite becoming a revenge-wielding agent of death, a tightrope Eric walks throughout the movie. The following scene is another great example of the filmmakers maximising the use of their characters for their best effect. Here, we are introduced to Gideon, who owns a pawn shop. An interesting fact here is that Gideon is played by John Polito. Polito is who the author of the graphic novel James O'Barr based the look of this character on, so I'm sure he was thrilled with this casting. What I like about this character is that although short-lived, he links a lot of the characters together and helps progress the plot with his presence, setting them all on a path towards each other. We learn something of Gideon as well as Tintin in this scene, and nothing is wasted. These characters could have interacted with random known names and stitched them together later, and it sounds so simple, but keeping all of these interactions between the core cast really tightens up the script. So instead of having characters over here, and characters over there, which you then have to force together into a larger movie, you have a situation like this where the main core of characters are already interacting with each other by proxy of their relationship with Gideon and the interactions that he has with each. Later, Gideon brings Top Dollar into the picture, at which point his purpose has been fulfilled and his character is no longer required. It's a cold way to look at it, but it works perfectly. In the sequence that follows, we're given a rooftop run by the Crow. It looks cool, and it has Nine Inch Nails absolutely killing it in the background with a cover of Dead Souls. But I always wondered if this scene could have been more. Perhaps they were limited by the budget and technology of their time, but half expected Eric to be jumping incredible distances between buildings. But it's just a guy running around. I've often wondered if this scene didn't quite pan out as they'd hoped. It's a small nitpick, to be fair, not really a criticism. I still enjoyed it, but I'm interested to know if anyone else has thought this before. Eric's showdown with Tintin is much more effective. In this scene, Eric's new powers are showcased, and instead of somebody just spelling out what he can do, we see it for ourselves. We don't know anything about Eric's prowess in life, but a great deal of speed, skill and strength are on show here, and I think it's safe to assume that these are brought about by the Crow. We are also shown glimpses of Crow vision, as I call it, his ability to see what the Crow sees. It's an older film, of course, but it's refreshing to watch a movie where we're just able to infer what's happening instead of it being spelled out with lengthy, blocky dialogue. It just gets on with it. I love it. Other powers were shown in this scene, and Eric's next are his invulnerability to weapons, a limited psychic ability, and later on an ability to slip in and out of shadows. Now, we are never explicitly shown this ability, but he has the ability to disappear mid-conversation for dramatic effect, which kind of reminds me of Batman, actually. In the graphic novel, it's a little more obvious as an actual ability, so I'm going to take it that it's a power he possesses here, although it's a little inconsistent. A little further on into the movie, and after Gideon's encounter with the Crow, we are introduced to Top Dollar through this character as discussed earlier. Top Dollar is never mentioned by name in the film, but he is credited as such, and he is a character lifted straight out of the comic. He's a very different character here from the book, but I like what they did with him. Having this overarching villain controlling the criminal element makes a lot of sense, essentially becoming the big bad. The scene wastes no time in carving out his character, along with his half-sister, Micah. We can see that they're both sadistic characters, and Top Dollar displays a sense of melancholy and a longing for excitement, traits that will be prevalent throughout the movie. It helps the movie that both characters are shown to have mystical beliefs from the outset, so they're both fairly willing to accept the idea of the Crow and his powers, which helps us as an audience also suspend our disbelief. I also enjoy here how we are introduced to the Trash nightclub, which will be an important location throughout the movie. The music, the look, it's all done really well, and having this consistent location helps us as an audience keep track of what's going on in the story and why. Again, these are simple things to do, but very effective. Another consistent location is Eric's apartment. These are almost like HQs for our opposing forces, and both of these really help the story. A good example, in my opinion, of why this is important is Star Wars: Rise of Skywalker. That film couldn't sit still for 2 seconds, and the characters were constantly bombing around from one scene and location to the next. It was almost impossible to keep up with what was going on, and it was dizzying. Having these bases lets us catch our breath with some small character moments that help drive the story forwards. Just small things, but important things in my eyes. In amongst all of this, you have a couple of side plots going on. You have Officer Albert and his superior Torres at loggerheads for some reason. I understand from a story point of view why they have this B plot, but honestly, it does nothing for me. Some people in life generally are this cantankerous, but I don't really understand why Torres is there, or why he's like this. It provides some other drama while the main plot catches his breath, I suppose, but I just don't care for this relationship or this story. He's just there, stirring up trouble and being less than helpful to Albert. Perhaps this is just to play into the theme of corrupted power, which is also displayed by Top Dollar. But in a story meant to inspire hope, I would have preferred to see a police force working together as a unit against organised crime. But maybe that's just me. The other B plot is the strained relationship between Sarah and her mother Darla. I prefer this plot because Eric has a direct impact on it and vice versa. Plus, the relationship changes and grows throughout the movie, showing some of that hope and indeed development sorely missing from the other B plot. Speaking of these B characters, I really like how they allow Eric to show another side of himself. In his interactions with both, he shows a human side, one that is filled with grief and longing, but also with some bright spots of humour and kindness. We get a really good idea of the good man Eric once was, despite the sheer amount of violence that he dishes out over the course of the movie. They strike an excellent balance with the character, as I remember these moments just as strongly as, say, the huge fight above the nightclub. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The scene in Albert's apartment really allows Lee to shine as an actor. He goes from playful and humorous to grieving and pain so easily. It's a really great scene. As an audience, we can't help but be drawn in by Lee's performance to feel what Eric feels. I feel much the same way about the can't rain all the time scene with Sarah. It's a really small moment, but when she asks him if he's a clown and he replies sometimes, there's just something in that moment in that scene that gets to me. There's a vulnerability about Eric, a wanting to connect with Sarah, but also the pain he feels after touching her. It's a poignant moment where much is unsaid, but it does its job of show don't tell and the inner conflict is clear. He misses Sarah, but to be near her brings back the pain of that awful night a year ago. The excellent score by Graham Revell really elevates the moment as well. Next up for some justice is Funboy. The film makes good use of the music in this scene. I love the crow flying to Eric, and then the two of them just waiting outside the hotel building as the song ramps up, leading to that confrontation. It's just beautifully done. The confrontation itself is tense as we know what's coming. The scene plays out a little differently in the book as the pair have a frank discussion about Funboy's behaviour, and there's almost a respect between the two as Funboy accepts his deserved fate. It's a little bit different here, but we also get an idea of just how powerful Eric has become. He's seemingly invincible as he disposes of Funboy with ease. In the bathroom, we see Darla cowering. Of course, she has no idea who Eric is or what he wants. She's terrified. There's a really dark, ominous moment where he looks at her with contempt and makes a move towards her with the score conveying horror or dread. There's a second there where we as an audience think something awful is about to happen. Eric has been driven insane after all. In the book, he is more so, but here on the screen it is only really hinted at. His mind is still largely intact, whereas his comic book counterpart is a lot more deranged. Now what follows is the turning point in the relationship between Darla and her daughter Sarah. Eric uses his power to remove the drugs from her system, and he sets her on her way towards the right path. This act of kindness is not without consequences, however. You may notice that after this scene, Eric has electrical tape around his hands and torso, covering some wounds. But hang on, if he's invincible, why does he need those? It's not made mention of in the movie, but it is in a deleted scene. Because Eric uses his powers for something other than his quest for vengeance, he is punished by having his healing power taken away in this instance. His hands are slashed from the swipes of the razor blade in this scene and a deleted one, which he does not recover from. When he returns to his mission, his powers return, but these wounds remain. In the book, it plays out a little differently. There, the wounds are a result of Eric cutting himself as he is overcome by overwhelming grief. I think a mainstream audience might struggle to understand a hero doing something like this, which is why I believe they sidestepped it by having it happen a different way instead. I would be okay with this either way, but I think they're playing Eric off as someone who has it still mostly together and is something of a heroic character. Eric does show some kindness in the comic, but I don't know if that version is quite as heroic as the one they're going for in the film, so I understand why they went with it in this direction. One of the scenes that most people will remember is the flaming crow scene, and it would be remiss of me to skip right past it. It follows a very fitting death for T-Bird, who is blown up in his car by his own explosives. In fact, all the members are killed by the things that they love, or their sins if you prefer to look at it that way. Tintin by his knives, Funboy by his addiction, and finally T-Bird by his explosives. Skank is thrown to his death later on. This is ironic and poetic, of course, as Eric was thrown to his death earlier in the film. A few scenes later, and the stage is set for the big showdown. Skank is at Thrash nightclub under the protection of Top Dollar, and Eric is on top of his apartment playing his guitar one last time before it all goes down. The guitar solo starts off measured and controlled, but soon the rage takes over and he smashes his guitar to pieces before the scene transitions over to Trash nightclub in full swing. This is one of my favourite scene transitions of all time. All that emotion and energy leading up to this busy nightclub scene before it transitions again to the boardroom upstairs. It's just really well done, and as an audience, we're hooked on what's going to happen next. It's on. So this is it. The scene we've all been waiting for. Eric versus Top Dollar. Probably the one scene most people think of when they think of The Crow. Now, we've seen Eric take out bad guys one-on-one, but how will he fare against a room full of bad guys armed to the teeth? I think their bosses who run the city and ultimately answer to Top Dollar at the head of the table. It's never made clear, but I think it's safe to infer. It's an interesting scene which separates Top Dollar from most movie villains. Most villains want to make as much money as possible, or rule the world. It's usually something two-dimensional like that. It turns out that Devil's Night has been a profitable venture for everybody at the table, but Top Dollar wants to cause so much damage that the gods will notice them again. His motivations don't really seem to align with your typical villain. Top Dollar seeks more control and influence like any other typical villain, but he wants to gain it through the use of anarchy and chaos. This way, he can assert even more dominance and power across the city. In short, Top Dollar's motivations transcend mere financial gain here. He seeks power, control, and influence through the deliberate cultivation of anarchy and chaos. This approach aligns with his vision of dominance and serves his larger ambitions beyond monetary gain. After a brief exchange between Eric and Top Dollar, enough bullets are unloaded on Eric that he should have been killed 100 times over. Instead, his body disappears. This is the shadow power I discussed earlier, his ability to slip in and out of the shadows. How exactly this works, we don't know and we never find out, but it works to great effect here. After re-entering the fray, an all-out assault ensues between Eric and the bosses. Top Dollar, Micah and Grange wisely distance themselves from the carnage and make their escape. Eric utters the words, "You're all going to die," which is lifted straight from the comic, and he's not wrong. Lee is able to showcase his martial arts skill as he effortlessly defeats his adversaries. There's an interesting tonal shift towards the end of the fight. In the beginning, Eric is dispatching the bad guys to the music of After the Flesh by My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult. It's even played for a laugh when Skank tries to hide behind a defenseless woman. One of the men is put through the window and the crowds below scream in panic. The energetic music has gone and is now replaced by a dark score from Graham Revell. The violence is no longer fun, it's dark and scary, and so the cycle of violence continues. When there's only Skank left, Eric almost looks villainous himself as he stalks his prey. Now this is only my opinion here, but I can't help but feel like the film is making a clever observation about the audience's thirst for violence. Up until this moment, we've all, me included, been absolutely loving how much bloodshed Eric is causing here. He's unstoppable and we're enjoying it because these men deserve it. But when the music changes and the tone shifts, Eric suddenly looks like a monster. What has he become? What have we become? This film is making a commentary about how violence begets further violence. Look at what's happened. Eric is getting his revenge, but at what cost? How many people have died? How many innocent people were just hurt below? It's a morally grey area, which is a fascinating one to discuss. Moral ambiguity aside, Skank gets what's coming to him, and Eric must make his escape. The police are hunting him down. We're obviously rooting for Eric here after everything he's been through, but you can hardly blame the cops for trying to stop him. He's basically just committed a one-man gang warfare. After an assist from Officer Albert, Eric is at Shelley's grave and ready to make his peace with the afterlife. Top Dollar is still out there, but at this point, he really isn't a concern for Eric. As far as he knows, he wasn't directly responsible for what happened to him and Shelley, and he's finally had his revenge and his story is seemingly over. What happens next forces Eric to confront his pain and grief head on. When we meet Sarah at the beginning of the movie, he winced at her touch and then tried to avoid her altogether when she came to the apartment looking for him. He finally sets aside his grief in that scene and comforts Sarah, but now he must put aside his own pain and save her from Top Dollar. In a deleted scene, the school cowboy warns Eric that this is outside the scope of his revenge mission and he will not have the protection of the Crow, but he goes anyway. In the final movie, they play it differently. No longer protected by the power of the Crow after it's injured, Eric selflessly battles Top Dollar on the roof of the church to save his friend. In some ways, Sarah embodies and personifies his pain and grief. She's a walking memory from a happier time, of that fateful night. So for him to go through all of this shows that he's indeed found redemption. Ultimately, Top Dollar is defeated, and after saying goodbye this time, Eric finally finds closure and peace as Shelley comes for him. That scene with that score playing in the background is the closure that I needed as well, and like many other scenes throughout the film, it gives me goosebumps. There were a number of sequels with different characters, but nothing really of note. I think perhaps the film works best as a one and done. To answer the question, yes, this film absolutely does still hold up 30 years later. In fact, there are films coming out today with all the technology and special effects that they have, and I don't think they come anywhere close to the storytelling that we see here in this film. It's a very special film that I always love watching, and I've enjoyed discussing it here for you in this video. Thank you for watching, and rest in peace, Brandon.
You are gonna be a bad mother.